Hey you guys, today we are talking about our next macromolecule, and those are lipids. So we've talked about carbohydrates, we're going to be talking about proteins, and now we're talking about lipids. And so lipids are also known as fats, and we find fats in foods like avocados, those are high in fat. Fish has lots of healthy fat in it, and oil is a type of fat, or grease is a type of fat. We see it in nuts and seeds. And so remember that while these foods have lipids in them, they don't have just lipids. They have all sorts. They have proteins and lipids and carbohydrates, but these tend to be higher lipid foods, meaning they have a higher content of lipids. And so let's talk about what lipids are, or what fats are. So lipids are a macromolecule, meaning that they're a big molecule with lots of elements in them, lots of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So yes, they contain carbon. The C is the symbol for carbon, H for hydrogen, and O for oxygen. So these are the elements or the nutrients that we find in a lipid. Similar, actually exactly the same as a carbohydrate. So here's the carbon, here's the oxygen, and here's the hydrogen. And so remember that when we eat this food, these pieces are broken down, the energy is released, and they are converted into other molecules. And so the monomer of a lipid is a fatty acid. And so this is a fatty acid. It's a chain of carbons and hydrogens. There's an oxygen over here, but it's lots of carbons and hydrogens, chain of carbons and hydrogens. And the function of a fatty acid is to store energy. So there's lots of energy in the carbon-hydrogen bond. And since there's a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds, there's a lot of energy in a fatty acid. So lots of calories in a fatty acid. And so this is our monomer. And fatty acids can be either saturated, which means that they have a straight line. They are made in a straight line. And that's because they are saturated with energy. Every single bond is completely full of energy. And so therefore, it sort of sticks out like a straight line. An unsaturated fat, or an unsaturated fatty acid, is a bent one. So here it is, you can see that there is less energy here in this bond, in the carbon-carbon bond. And that's what causes it to be bent. And that's why we call it an unsaturated fat. It is going to be less saturated with energy. And so here, if we look at the, here we go. If we look at the polymer of, if we look at the polymer of a fatty acid, or a polymer, of a lipid, there are two types of polymers. Let's first talk about one, a triglyceride. And so let's underline the prefix tri. This should make a lot of sense. There are 3 fatty acids in a triglyceride. And this should also make a lot of sense. The function of a triglyceride is to store long-term energy. So it is good at this because it has so many bonds. So if we eat too many carbohydrates, we're going to store that energy. We're going to take those pieces, those carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, we're going to turn it into fat, into this triglyceride, and we're going to store that energy in these carbon-hydrogen bonds. And so this molecule is very good at what it does because it has so many bonds. And so it should make sense that we have 3 fatty acids in a triglyceride. And if any of these fatty acids are bent or not saturated, well, we call this an unsaturated fat. And so we have saturated fats, which would be 3 straight lines. And we have unsaturated fats, which means that one of these could be bent or unsaturated with energy. So these are your healthier fats. The unsaturated fats are your healthier fats because they have a little bit less energy in them. And so why is it good to have a little bit less energy? Well, when we eat sugar, one of 2 things will happen. If we eat just enough sugar, or if we eat just enough food, we will burn the energy as fuel, similar to gasoline for a car. So if we have just enough gas in the car, it'll make the car go. However, unlike a car, if we have too much energy, we will store it as fat. So if we take those carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens of a carbohydrate, we will turn them into a fat molecule, and we store that energy in this triglyceride. So once again, the matter or the elements are conserved. They don't disappear. They become they are rearranged into a fat molecule. And so the second type of polymer is a phospholipid. So we talked about triglycerides, and now we're talking about phospholipids. A phospholipid is just what it says it is. It's a phosphate molecule and a lipid. So a phosphate molecule is simply, let's call it this round part here. It has a phosphorus in it. So if we look at our table of elements, phosphorus is going to be over here. And so because it has a phosphorus at this part, we call it a phospholipid. And so a phospholipid has only 2 fatty acid tails, so it's a little bit different. And it has a different function than a triglyceride. So we remember that triglycerides store energy, but phospholipids, well, they make up the boundaries of a cell membrane. So we've talked about cell walls, which are a carbohydrate. Cell membranes are something totally different. Some cells have cell walls, like plant cells, like bacteria cells. They have cell walls. But our cells don't have cell walls. We have cell membranes. Every single type of cell on Earth has a cell membrane. Some have a cell membrane and a cell wall, but every single cell has a cell membrane. And if you look closely at this picture, you will see the phosphate head and the 2 fatty acid tails. The phosphate head and the 2 fatty acid tails. Phosphate head and the 2 fatty acid tails. And this is how a cell membrane is made up, of this bilayer, or this 2 layers of phospholipids. And that's what makes up our cell membranes. And we'll talk more about this later on when we start talking about cells. And so phospholipids have a unique quality which allow them to be the cell membrane. And this is cool. They have one side of them, so this right here is going to be their hydrophilic. That phosphate group is water loving. It is hydrophilic. So hydro meaning water, philic or phile meaning loving. So water loving. So this phosphate side is hydrophilic, whereas this water fearing side is hydrophobic, meaning it's water afraid of. It is fearing water. It does not want to be associated with water. So if we look at this picture here, if we can picture that there's some water in here and there's water outside, we can see that the phosphate groups, or the water-loving sides of the phospholipids, are pointed towards the water. And the water-fearing sides are pointed inward, away from the water. They form this sort of layer that water can't get into. And so they protect those little fatty acid tails because they don't want to be near the water. They're hydrophobic. And so here's a little video. Let me play this, and it'll show you why. So we're going to mix oil and water, and watch how it forms little bubbles in the water, because that oil is a lipid, is a fat, and it has those hydrophobic fatty acid tails, and it doesn't want to associate with the water, so they all combine together to get away from the water, and you can see that bubble. And that is why our phospholipids will come together and form that membrane, because of the hydrophobic side, which they protect their water-fearing tails, but they let the hydrophilic side interact with the water. And those are our cell membranes. And that's it for lipids today. I hope that you guys have a great day, and we'll talk soon.